So
introduce yourself. Yeah?
My name is Al-Azhar. I'm working at the office of the Mufti. Not from al-Azhar, Medina, from Cairo University, so I don't know where do I lie. And so basically you mentioned, I agree with a lot of your points. I actually wrote a paper on Kalam and how Asatizas in Singapore's engagement with Kalam is actually antithetical to what the Sahabas actually, how they engage with it. So I totally agree what you said on Kalam. However, the values and principles that you put forth, I don't think you apply it on all of the elements across the spectrum. For example, LGBT. I've actually watched all of your commentaries on LGBT, and you commented a lot about LGBT despite your sort of lack of expertise on it. For example, very quickly say, I don't know, in one of your videos in 2012, you say that I don't know whether it is something that is natural or not natural, if you are born with or you're not born with. And the significance of that statement actually shows a lot. Actually, it shows that you do not care to even look into the matter before you make such comment. So, from what I've seen in all of your videos, you actually relegate homosexuality, and this is a modern conception of homosexuality, a 19th century conception of homosexuality, into that of a carnal desire, into that of, in your own words, urge. Whereas pre-modern Islamic scholars and pre-modern Muslims made several crucial distinctions between the attraction and the sexual desire. They have words such as ashik, they have words such as yamin ila al-jamal, they have words such as ubna, for example, and they have words such as luti, and these are all important crucial distinctions. Whereas from what I have seen and from what I have watched in your videos, you actually maintaining the same heritage or the same heteronormative Judeo-Christian paradigm of homosexuality, which is a non-sex positive paradigm or narrative. So I would like you to respond on that, because pre-modern Islamic scholars actually they move beyond the prohibition of sodomy and they talk about the attraction in itself. In fact, in the Quran, whenever God promised of Hurul Ain, there's also a promise of Wildan, Wilman. Yet no scholars, modern scholars, talk about this concept of Wildan and Wilman. What is the significance of this Wildan and Wilman? And then modern Muslims' antipathy towards homosexuals is actually antithetical to pre-modern Muslims' antipathy to homosexuals. Even Rifa'at Tahtawi during the modern period, he was shocked when the Europeans were not as attracted to boys or beardless youth. Whereas in his country, Egypt, or for example, another Muhammad Safarini, another Islamic scholar, when he traveled to Europe, he was shocked that Algiers was so attracted to beardless boys, whereas in Europe, it was so ethical in his own words. So I would like you to respond to that. And I would like you to ask another question.
Is it the same topic or different?
Yeah, it is the same topic actually. Do you think it is un-Islamic for someone to express his love for the same sex, or i.e. as in homosexual visibility or expressions? Because during pre-modern Islam, you have expressions of love for the same sex or for beardless boys have become a literary convention. It has become a literary convention throughout millenniums actually. So I'm just saying that, for example, right now, someone say I'm going to support the rights of gays, and you quickly say that, oh, that is un-Islamic, that is unethical. And when someone say that you are gay, in the same time you are actually saying that he is also a sodomite, he is also a luti, whereas in the past he was not.
Okay, I take it you didn't attend the lecture yesterday.
No.
No? Okay, so this was the first question that was asked yesterday.
Yeah, so I would like to respond.
I gave, I think, a 10-15 minute response yesterday. How many of you attended, by the way, yesterday? So a number of you attended. I don't want to repeat all of that,
okay.
But it is videotape. Yesterday, it was videotape. So you can listen to that. That I think most of what you have said I respond to there. But you are correct, by the way. I'm not an expert in psychological sexual urges, and therefore I know my limits. The fact that I'm not an expert, I'm not commenting, and that was my point. And even yesterday I said that whether it's nature, whether it's nurture, the scientific community, by the way, is still debating this issue. Psychologists, psychiatrists, you'll find them on both sides, and it's not my area to get involved in which one is stronger position. But I did say, from a legal perspective, acting upon the desire and inclination to engage in homosexual acts, the legal perspective, it doesn't really matter whether it's nurture or nurture. I.e., penetrating a person of the same gender sexually will be haram, regardless of whether the urge is from nature or nurture. This was my point yesterday. I was very explicit about that. Yesterday as well, I clarified that the urge itself is not haram or sinful. I was very explicit about this. The urge itself will not be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It could be beyond your control. It could be nature, it could be nurture, but in the end of the day, every urge that comes, every urge, whether we call it natural or unnatural, every urge that is not acted upon, Allah Azza wa Jal has overlooked it. You bring up a very interesting point, and that is, it was well known throughout Islamic civilizations that there is this genre of erotic literature, of the dangers of beardless boys, right? Of the problems of being alone in khalwa with a young man. Books of adab and fiqh even mention this, much less being alone with a woman. There's lots of adab of talib al-ilm and mufti and mustafti that talk about this sheikh should not be alone with his, young male student if he's handsome and whatnot. You're absolutely correct in pointing all of this out, but you will not find in any of those books a justification, a license to engage in what is called luti, or what is called homosexual acts. So it's one thing to understand that there are urges, and it is true, by the way, that by and large, Muslim society was aware that it is possible to be attracted to a young boy. And they, in fact, Ibn al-Qayyim's book, Ad-Da' wad-Dawa, it is alleged that it was written in response to a questioner who was infatuated with, it's all about love. And you can interpret it that a man is loving a woman, or you can interpret it that a man is loving another man, and he's saying, I'm always tempted and whatnot, what should I do? So Ibn al-Qayyim wrote his entire book, Ad-Da' wad-Dawa, over this. So it was understood, but it was never tolerated to act upon. There's a big difference. And in fact, what if I were to flip it around and say almost every single pre-Islamic and post-Islamic poetry begins with describing women? Does that mean Islam wants us to describe a woman's body? It's not the reality. That there's literature, there's genres of poetry, and then there's law and fiqh. Homosexuals existed in Islamic lands like they existed in every land. There's no denying this. Anybody who denies this is not aware of it's. I mean, Abu Nuwas and other famous poets, they were well known, his poetry. Now, Abu Nuwas, you know Abu Nuwas obviously, right? Abu Nuwas and his poetry, okay, do you think any faqih justified what he's writing? Does his existence justify the legality of what he's writing about?
So what do you mean by justify?
Is it permissible in the Sharia to do what he's describing? That's what I'm saying.
To do what?
Well, he describes, you want me to be explicit? He's pretty explicit when he says
yeah, but that is the problem, you see. He did not say that he has ever committed sodomy. Whereas people say that he has committed sodomy. He expressed love for the other
Well, he expressed more than just love, by the way.
Yeah, but that is
Very
the point.
erotic
But that is the
poetry.
point. Just because someone expressed it in poetry back then, they didn't typically say that he is a luti. That is the point that I'm trying to make.
Who is saying? Yesterday I was very explicit, today I'll be explicit in front of you. I just said it again. The urge to have same-sex attraction. Honestly, I agree with if what you're saying is we need to be more tolerant of people who are same-sex attraction. That's exactly what I said yesterday. But there's a red line, and that red line is committing acts of sodomy. The Sharia will never, ever, you cannot bend the Sharia to justify this. The evidences are qat'i. قطعي الدلالة قطعي الثبوت. The qissa of قوم لوط, right? أتأتون رجالا ما سبقكم من أحد من العالمين إنكم لتأتون رجالا شهوة من دون النساء, right? تقطعون السبيل, right? This is very explicit, and that is why you will not find a single alim who ever interpreted the Qawm Lut to be only rape. which is a modernist progressive interpretation. Okay? In fact, the Quran does not mention rape at all. It mentions shahwatan min dun nisa. The illa is shahwatan min dun nisa. So for anybody to come and say the story of Qawm Lut does not prohibit homosexuality, honestly, with that type of, there's no point even arguing with, in my opinion, with such a person, because the story is explicit. So if you're arguing for more sympathy for people who have SSA, same-sex attraction.
No, I'm arguing for us to move beyond the red line. I mean, it's done and set in stone that sodomy is prohibited in Islam. But
so you agree that it is
yes,
prohibited?
I agree with you, but I think we should move beyond that. We should focus on a post-prohibition narrative.
Okay.
And I would like to clear this conception actually. It's not true that only the poets were involved in this literary convention.
And ulama, I agree.
Abdullah Ashraf Barawi, who was the Shaykh of al-Azhar for 30 years, expressed love for boys.
Yes, it is. He expressed it, but did he ever act upon it, as far as we know?
But that's the problem, you see. I mean, just because someone expressed love does not mean he committed it.
How many? But who's saying I didn't mean that?
But that is the modern conception of homosexuality. When you call someone a homosexual now, you explicitly, you're in the same time implying that he has committed sodomy, and that is the problem with us Muslims.
You have a valid point. I mean, I agree with you to a certain extent. At the same time, I would argue that such poetry could be interpreted to mean poetry between lovers as well. Most of this genre of poetry you talk about, we know that Shabrawi and others is writing for a boy because of biographical and historic information. But if you read the actual poem, generally speaking, the poetry is neutral enough that it allows for a man loving a woman. And I think there's a reason for this, that even they had enough haya to not put it in the poem, especially if they had association with fiqh. I'm not talking about Abu Nuwas, who was X-rated in pornography. Abu Nuwas, I mean, if you read him, astaghfirullah, is disgusting and vulgar. That's why Abu Nuwas has nothing to do with fiqh. But Shabrawi and others, I agree with you. You find a genre of ulama that are writing about poetry that historically we kind of think has to do with love poetry. But in my humble opinion, if you read it, you find, as I said, a sense of dignity that, I'm not going to be explicit about this. I'm grappling with this and I'm just going to write. And this is their method of expressing it. Okay. But
to pick up from not the same topic, but if you're saying, okay, if you're okay with arguing about sympathy and tolerance to a particular red line, it makes a difference that until today we have the literature of Abu Nawas available for us to read. So in this tolerance today, if someone writes something like Abu Nawas today, would we then burn his book? Would we then say, no, that's haram, that's not good? Or would we allow it to reach many generations later, just like we have this ability to read Abu Nawas's books?
So again, you're conflating a number of issues here. The fact that Abu Nawas still exists to our time, do you really think the ulama of the time of Abu Nawas or later would be reading such poetry in their gatherings and encouraging their students to read it? It will exist because filth will continue to exist. Its existence is not an argument for its legitimacy. Frankly, reading...
We're not talking about its legitimacy, it's how we respond to it. Are we going to shun it or are we going to let it be? That's what
Well, I mean, I'll have to go back and research this, and I didn't research Abu Nawas's poetry, but I have no doubt, if you were to go back to his era, you will find ulama that were highly critical. I mean, that poetry is as vulgar and as explicit as is humanly possible. It's frankly erotic even for 2015, which is saying a lot. Okay?
I think you are conflating the issue to that of Abu Nawas' poetry. I'm talking about the perceptions, reconstructing modern Muslims' perceptions about homosexuality, not just about erotic.
But I agree with you to a certain extent, and that is that, yes, there is an attitude amongst modern Muslims that is harsher than needs be.
Yes.
I agree with you. But I just want to be cautious here that, are we going to now think that it's time to re-understand the prohibition of sodomy in Islam? This is really, in my opinion, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to prove to me how that is even possible, given you have only one of two options. Either you say that the verses in the Quran are no longer applicable, which is the Reformation way to go, the Christian way to go. Who cares what Exodus and Genesis and Deuteronomy says, okay? And if you say that, then then that's an attitude that mainstream Muslims are going to view as kufr. You understand? Or you take the other progressive route, which is to say the Qawm Lut story only applies to rapists and not to consensual sex. In which case, we will have a bit of a more academic discussion, and we'll quote you verses in a hadith and whatnot, which is very explicit, that to read in rape to the Qawm Lut story is a figment of imagination.
Okay.
You understand what I'm saying here?
I'm not going there, but I think I understand where you're coming from. I think we should let other people ask you.
Okay.
Thank you.
But I appreciate the honesty and the
I appreciate your
and the frankness of the question. Yeah, and the frankness of the question.
Thank you so much.
Ustaz Mahmoud.
I think he raised the bar so high. He's like, everybody had this question. It was so simple and easy. And now it's
I
like,
think I can add on, it's a bit tied to this issue, but it's
Yes.
more of what is happening in Singapore.
Yes.
What part of this discussion is also to learn from our experiences as Muslims in American society. Singapore, I mean, we're living in a context where diversity is growing, and part of it is also different sexual orientations. As far as rightly pointed out, it's been with us since the beginning of history. But what is different now is that what was in the past urges or inclinations that once in the private sphere, and we
are
have
now becoming
tolerated.
mainstream and
Yeah.
acceptable.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's where the contestations occur, when you want to impose certain values,
Yeah.
and then different religious groups are also getting into that contestation of values. And so how do we negotiate our values within other with other different orientations? I mean, like in the US, it's a country of freedom of expressions, freedom of choice. So Muslims there basically grew up already living and facing these issues. How do you educate your children where they join schools or workplaces where these contestations are pretty much normal?
Jay, and by the way, again, getting back to your issue, the existence, and it goes back to your question as well, the existence of these types of issues does not legitimize them. A simple example from the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, the ahadith of mukhannithin and mukhannithat are mutawatir, right? The prohibition, la'ana Allah mukhannithin and mukhannithat, there's mutawatir. And yet in the hadith in Sahih Bukhari, one of the mukhannithin was visiting, one of the women, and he was describing another woman, and then the Prophet, when he found out about this, he said that let this man not enter upon you ever after this. Now, this is interesting here because on the one hand, we have a clear la'na upon mukhannithin and mukhannithat. And this is basically transgender, or basically, you understand. There's a clear la'na. Yet there were people in Medina that were known. So the fact that it exists doesn't mean that it should become acceptable in status quo. Allah's la'na is still going to be there. Another famous hadith in Bukhari, this is shocking when average Muslims hear this, because they think Medina was like a Jannah on earth. No, there were people there that were evil. And it is well known there were prostitutes in Medina at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Hadith is in Bukhari that the Prophet ﷺ said, if I were to do rajm to anybody without bayina, it would be fulana. And the fulana was the well known that she was the one, you understand? You understand what I'm saying, right? So, does this justify the existence? The fact that it's there, does it legitimize? This is my point. You always have people that are mukhannithin, mukhannithat. It's not an urge that is new. There have always been people that have this desire in them. But typically they were hidden, outcast, whatnot. Even the Prophet ﷺ knew they were there. But it's not, the problem now, and I said this yesterday, for the first time in human history, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition especially, maybe one can argue ancient Greek, but especially in the Abrahamic tradition, these inclinations are not just normalized, they are celebrated. In fact, they are made to be pious. Never before in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition have people of this persuasion been considered to be religious role models, i.e. acting upon it, not just inclining, acting upon it. Okay? Even the Qawm Lut said, أخرجوا لوطا من قريتهم إنهم أناس يتطهرون. Even Qawm Lut understood that what they're doing is something that requires tatahur, and they don't want to be made tatahur, right? أخرجوا قوم what is it أخرجوا قوم لوط أخرجوا آل لوط من قريتكم إنهم أناس يتطهرون, right? So إنهم أناس يتطهرون بمعنى أنهم عرفوا أنهم خبثاء نجس, أنهم عرفوا ذلك. مع ذلك, right, in our times, for the first time in human history, you have a priest and a rabbi and now even an imam embracing this lifestyle publicly. In America we have multiple, I don't know about you guys, in America we have multiple imams and imamas, mashallah, as well, that have embraced this lifestyle publicly, and they're living with their partners publicly. Aslan, this is i'tiraf, and they're performing nikahs and whatnot, and this is the first time in human history this is happening. Its existence doesn't mean it is legitimate. And your question about how we deal with these differences, so I'm not talking about Singapore because I'm not that familiar with your culture. In America, the position that I've held, which has caused me trouble from both sides, is that it is a lost battle in America. The majority of states have acknowledged it. Right now, as we speak, the Supreme Court is looking at it again, and most likely they're going to rule in favor that, because the issue has come, by the way, so 20-something states have allowed it and 14 have not or something. So a couple that got married in one of the states moved to one of the states that doesn't allow it. So they're not being allowed health benefits and whatnot. So they have taken it to the Supreme Court. Right now, as we speak, the Supreme Court is looking into it. And in all likelihood, they're going to rule in favor of this arrangement and say that it must be binding in all states. Okay, so it's a lost battle. Majority of Christians and Jews in America have now embraced this, and it is only a small minority, the ultra-Orthodox Jews and the evangelical and the Southern Baptists. That's it, and the Catholics. I mean, they have not, even Catholicism, it'll change in a while, pretty sure, but it's a minority now. So it's a lost battle in terms of courts, in terms of public opinion. So what does this mean for us as Muslims? What should we do about gay marriage being legal? I mean, my position was that in this regard, we should not jump on the bandwagon of supporting legal gay marriage, nor should we jump on the bandwagon of trying to prohibit it. Rather, our position should be, and it's a controversial one, the American government should not have any right to decide what is or is not a marriage. It's not the role of our government. Now again, I'm speaking from an American perspective. I'm not familiar with your constitution or your government. From an American perspective, morality is not in the domain of the government. But the government cannot impose on churches and synagogues and mosques its definition of marriage, because that's not the domain of the Constitution to tell us what is moral and immoral. So let the churches and synagogues and mosques preach their version of morality and marriage, and let the US Constitution and the governments and the courts decide whatever they want to do. And frankly, in America, again, and again I don't know for your country, the more freedoms any group is given, the more freedoms we are given. The more freedoms any group is given, the less the government is involved in anything, the better it is for all of us to do as we want to do. Therefore, in some ways, it is helpful for the American Muslims to ally with the LGBT community, believe it or not. And this has caused me a lot of problems in my circles to say this, right? In political issues, honestly, those people are of the most understanding of our plight and the most supportive of campaigning against Islamophobia, and the most powerful, because they had the same issues in the 80s and they overcame it, and they're very sympathetic to our plight. Why can't we take their help? But it's awkward because our community doesn't understand, and then they want moral tolerance from us, and we have to be clear and say no. And how do you explain this to them? We'll tolerate you politically but not morally. Right? It raises questions, and it's up to them, but I am not going to compromise on this position. For me, this is qat'iyat. To be brutally honest, a Muslim who understands the Quran and he still says it is halal to engage in same-sex, to me this is kufr bawah, personally. This is open kufr, just like you say khamr is halal, right? If he says riba is halal, And he knows Allah says in the Quran, أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. And he says riba is halal. To me, there is no ta'wil over here, right? In my humble opinion, the evidences of Qawm al-Lut are just as qat'i. And that's why there's never been any ikhtilaf in this regard. So we have to have that red line in this regard. How do we teach our children? Honestly, this is one of the big questions of our era. And there is no alternative other than to tell them the realities of the world. And that is to say, people have lifestyles that we don't agree with. And this applies to drugs, it applies to alcohol, it applies to gambling, and yes, it also applies to living lifestyles of homosexuality or whatnot. That it's not something that we approve of. There's nothing else to do other than to be frank with them. And you will be surprised at how mature young kids are. You will be surprised. Frankly, the worrisome problem is at the age of 10 or 12, they know more than we knew, than we were at 15, 20. You know, these days the kids are, in fact, they're going to be lecturing you about things you never even heard of. This is the reality. So I don't see any. I have 4 kids of my own. I'm struggling with them. My eldest is just a teenager now. I don't have an easy answer for you, but I have frank conversations with him, and there's nothing else to do other than lots of dua and hope that inshallah they grow up to understand the realities of our religion, and Allah knows best.
Yeah, Assalamualaikum. I'm Ridwan, working at movies. I have another question regarding what you mentioned about the American. And it's interesting to see how American Muslims to some extent can accept that the political reality is such that if you want more rights, you also cannot deny the rights of the others. In this case, LGBT, although morally, in our moral principle, it may be wrong. So my question is that, in Singapore, where there are calls for Muslims to ask for greater rights, for example, the lifting of the hijab ban, but at the same time, while we are pushing for one, which we see as our social rights, some of it is in the paradigm of human rights argument, it's a religious right. But then we are also pushing for the government to continue banning the LGBT group from getting more freedom. I think it's a bit of what does that show about a Muslim community? You only want thing for you, but you denying other the rights as well. And you put it simply that in American, it's quite workable, it's still controversial. So what do you think? So do you think that as a Muslim, liberal democracy is the way forward, is something that we can accept?
No, but see, here's my point. I clearly said, in my opinion, I was asked this, there were a number of states that had voting for LGBT. California, Proposition 8, famous example, last year or something. And I got calls from California, what should we do, should we vote or not? And the majority of ulama said you should vote to ban it. I was one of the few that said, no, you shouldn't. Don't try to go become their enemies, because it's actually going to harm you in the long run. But then neither, in my opinion, should you vote for it, because that is your tacit moral approval of something that is clearly against the Sharia. I said, just don't vote. Abstain. You don't have to go vote in every single bill and amendment, right?
Yeah.
So your position, or you said that, supporting their rights.
Because there are some segments of the Muslim community that feel that this liberal democracy is a Western concept. It's never, as a Muslim, you can't. We just want to.
It is a Western concept, but so.
Yeah, it is a Western.
So we're speaking in English.
Right? But it's a concept that you cannot use as a Muslim. You cannot live as a Muslim.
Then why are they living here?
I don't know, because I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that.
That's what I say to the Americans. I say that, why are you guys living here then? You can't have it both ways, but.
How to make the Muslim understand that this is the reality?
You're not going to ever make the entire Muslim. There will always be large pockets, I would say the majority, who cannot distinguish between politics and morality. They cannot understand that sometimes you have to be a politician. And that's why, alhamdulillah, ulama are not supposed to be politicians. Alhamdulillah. Because politicians have to make deals, broker deals, they have to compromise, they have to lie. That's what a politician does. You get the largest consensus and then you go with it, right? Alhamdulillah, we don't want our ulama to go with the flow. We don't want our ulama to just go with, no. Our ulama have to have standards, and that's why there are many ahadith, by the way, about ulama not entering abwab al-salatin. You should be aware of these ahadith, right? Many ahadith about ulama not going to the doors of the rulers and becoming friendly with the rulers. Because, and I'm not talking about any country, I'm just talking about the reality of the ahadith, that there are problems that are associated when this happens. So in America, from my understanding and opinion, we need to tell our larger Muslim community that whether you like it or not, you are living in a secular democracy. And in a secular democracy, there are going to be times where your vote will count, and there are going to be times where perhaps it's not wise for you to vote. And I would say, at least for us in America, most American Muslims are not understanding this. Maybe in the 80s we had a large group that is haram to vote, it's shirk to vote. You still have this in Singapore? No, that's gone now. So in the 80s in America, we had this movement that it is shirk to vote. And if you vote, then this is like kufr to do so. In England, it's still powerful, by the way. They still have this over there. But alhamdulillah, in America, by and large, it's moved on from that. And I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, the majority of ulama of our times, in fact, I don't know of any reputable alim who holds this hardcore fanatical view. It's the reality that you have to live. I think it's pretty straightforward that this is aqall al-mafsadatayn. You either sit back and do nothing, or at least you try to have a better of the two candidates. In some issues, not in all. In some issues, I say it's better not to vote.